Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're diving into how Americans view their government, specifically when it comes to spending. And, we've got this super interesting article
Yeah,
by historian Heather Cox Richardson.
that's a good one.
It's packed with insights, so let's just jump right in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's so much to unpack here, especially this whole idea that Americans have
Right.
these strong opinions about government spending.
Mm.
But a lot of times,
Yeah.
those opinions maybe aren't based on the full picture.
Right. And Richardson actually starts by taking us back in time to right after World War II.
Okay.
She talks about this period of
Oh, wow.
consensus where, surprisingly,
Okay.
both Democrats and Republicans largely agreed
Yeah.
on the role of government.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
After going through the Depression and then the war,
Right.
there was this shared sense
Yeah.
that the government had a responsibility to regulate businesses,
Mm-hmm.
provide safety net, invest in infrastructure, protect civil rights.
It almost sounds like a golden age of bipartisanship.
It really does.
But Richardson also makes it clear that not everyone was on board with this whole vision.
Exactly. She points out how certain groups, especially some big businesses and those opposed to social progress,
Uh-huh.
really felt like this expanded role of government was just a step too far.
Interesting.
They saw as like government overreach,
Right.
a threat to their own interests.
Yeah.
And I think this is where we start to see the seeds of discontent being sown.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of a growing nation, but also this underlying tension
Yeah.
about the role of government.
Right.
And then Richardson brings us to this pivotal moment, the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education ruling.
Okay.
Now, you'd think a ruling promoting equality would strengthen the idea of government as a force for good, but
But this is where it gets interesting.
okay.
Opponents of desegregation,
Mm-hmm.
they were actually incredibly savvy. They took that ruling and they reframed it
Uh-huh.
as an example of government overreach.
Wow.
They argued that forcing schools to integrate
Right.
was this unfair redistribution of wealth,
Interesting.
specifically from white to black Americans.
They basically took a landmark decision for equality and twisted it
Yeah,
to fit their anti-government agenda.
exactly. And this wasn't just some fringe argument either.
Wow.
This narrative, it gained traction over time.
Okay.
And by the 1980s, it really became like a cornerstone of political campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where figures like Ronald Reagan really come into play.
Yeah, yes. Reagan, he was like a master communicator.
He was?
And he knew how to really tap into people's anxieties.
For sure.
And the article talks about his use of the welfare queen trope.
Right. It was this powerful, albeit misleading anecdote
Right.
about this woman in Chicago who was living lavishly on government assistance.
And this story, even though it was based on a real case,
Yeah.
it was an extremely atypical case. Uh-huh. It just played into existing prejudices about, race and economics.
It's a classic example of how a simple story,
Right.
even if it's not totally accurate,
Yeah.
can have this huge impact
Exactly.
on public perception.
But what's so fascinating to me is that Richardson goes beyond just the anecdote.
Okay.
And she actually dives into the real data
Yeah.
on welfare usage.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out the vast majority of welfare recipients
Yeah.
aren't abusing the system.
Right.
They're struggling families,
Exactly.
often working multiple jobs,
Yeah.
who need that temporary assistance
Right.
just to get by.
It really highlights how important it is to be critical of the information
Yes.
that we're presented with.
Right?
We need to look beyond those attention-grabbing headlines
Yes.
and really examine the facts.
Okay, so that's how this narrative about government overreach and wasteful spending
Yeah.
really took hold.
Right.
But let's look at the reality of government spending since the 1970s.
Yeah.
Richardson points out something really interesting.
Okay.
While government spending has increased significantly,
Mm-hmm.
the federal workforce has actually shrunk.
How did that work?
That's where federal contractors come in.
Oh.
Instead of directly employing more people,
Right.
the government's increasingly relied on these private companies
Yeah.
to carry out its functions,
Okay.
particularly in areas like defense.
Interesting.
So it's become this less visible
Uh-huh.
but more expensive form of government activity.
Right.
That seems like it'd be pretty confusing for the average person,
Totally.
trying to understand where their tax dollars are going.
And the article actually provides some figures to illustrate this.
Okay.
For instance,
Yeah.
In 1960, federal employees made up about 3% of the workforce.
Wow.
Today, it's less than 1.5%.
Wow.
But at the same time,
Yeah.
the amount the government spends on contracts has just exploded.
So it's not just about how much money is being spent, it's how it's being spent. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And this brings us to another key point that Richardson makes.
Right.
Even though government spending has grown, polls show that most Americans actually support a lot of these programs. Social Security, Medicare, education, aid for the poor, even border security.
This is where that disconnect between perception and reality becomes crystal clear.
Right.
People seem to have this knee-jerk negative reaction to the phrase government spending. But when you ask them about specific programs, their opinions often change.
It's like they're saying, I hate government spending, but please don't touch my Medicare.
Right. Exactly.
But maybe it's not just about hypocrisy. Maybe it's about a lack of understanding.
I think you're hitting on something really crucial there.
Yeah.
If we don't understand how government programs actually function and, like, who benefits from them, it's easy to fall prey to these simplistic narratives about wasteful spending.
So we've got this historical backdrop of, like, growing skepticism toward government.
Yeah.
Combined with this disconnect between how people perceive government spending and what's actually happening.
Right.
And this is where Richardson brings us to, like, the present day, the Trump administration, and its focus on cutting government spending and programs related to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
And she even throws Elon Musk into the mix.
Wait, Elon Musk, what does he have to do with government spending?
Well, according to Richardson, Trump basically gave Musk this significant authority to oversee these major reductions in the federal workforce.
So Musk is essentially in charge of firing federal employees.
That's basically what it comes down to.
That seems like a pretty big deal.
It is. It's been causing a lot of disruption and concern, you can imagine.
Yeah.
Richardson highlights how many career employees have been let go and the impacts are being felt.
Across these various departments, we're talking about public health, scientific research, even nuclear security.
Wow, nuclear security. That's a little unnerving.
Yeah.
So what are the actual consequences of these cuts?
Yeah.
Is the government actually saving money like Trump claimed?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. What's fascinating here is that many of the people who voted for smaller government are now experiencing the negative consequences of those policies firsthand.
So it's kind of backfiring on them.
In some ways, yes. For example, the article mentions farmers who rely on government programs for conservation and agricultural assistance. Well, they're now facing cuts.
And they overwhelmingly voted for Trump. But
exactly. But they're the ones being hit hardest by this freeze on funding.
That's right. And those cuts to research funding, those are impacting universities and medical advancements across the country.
Even disaster relief and education funding, things that benefit Republican-dominated states, are on the chopping block.
It really exposes this disconnect between political rhetoric and the practical realities of governance.
Right.
Sometimes the people who are most vocal about cutting government waste are the ones who end up feeling the most pain when those cuts are actually made.
It's almost like they're cutting off their nose to spite their face.
Right.
But let's get into some specifics.
Okay.
Richardson mentioned some pretty shocking examples of how these cuts are actually playing out.
Right.
One that really stood out to me was the story about the National Nuclear Security Administration.
Oh, yeah. That's a disturbing one.
It is. Richardson reports that like over 300 employees were fired.
Okay.
And it turns out they were the people responsible for, you know, overseeing our nuclear weapons.
You're kidding me. That seems like a recipe for disaster.
Right. And get this, according to NBC News, officials are now like scrambling to rehire these workers, but they can't even reach them because their access to work email was cut off when they were fired.
Oh my gosh, that sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare.
It really does. But it's not just the nuclear stuff that's worrying.
Right.
The article also talks about how Trump instituted this like freeze on federal spending.
Yeah.
Which to me sounds kind of shady.
Yeah, it's actually illegal.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's called impoundment of funds.
Okay.
which basically means the president is withholding money that Congress already approved for these specific purposes.
So even though Congress has said,
Yeah.
yes, we want this money to go towards these programs,
Yeah.
Trump can just decide not
Right.
to spend it.
That's what he tried to do.
Wow.
But the Constitution, Congress, and the courts have all affirmed
Okay.
that once Congress approves a program, the president has to implement it.
So Trump was essentially going against the law.
That's what Richardson argues.
Wow.
And she makes a good point
Okay.
about the reason these programs exist in the first place.
Right, that Congress implemented them
Yeah.
because they saw a need and they thought these programs would benefit the American people.
Exactly. But it seems like Trump and his supporters were so focused on this idea of slashing government that they were willing to ignore the law.
Wow.
And potentially harm their own constituents in the process.
Which brings us back to those farmers who are now seeing their livelihoods threatened by these cuts.
And it's not just farmers.
Right.
Richardson quotes a Wisconsin farmer in the New York Times who said, this isn't just hippy-dippy stuff. This is affecting mainstream farmers. It seems like reality is starting to bite back.
Right. And it's not just farmers, right?
Right.
Remember we talked about how most Americans actually support a lot of government programs? Well, guess what?
Many of those programs are now at risk.
It's a classic case of be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
People might complain about government spending,
Right.
but they don't often realize how much they rely on those programs until they're gone.
So it's like a wake-up call.
Exactly. And it highlights a critical point that Richardson makes throughout the article, which is we need to be much more critical of the narratives we're being fed about government spending. Don't just accept the sound bites and slogans at face value.
Okay, so question everything.
Exactly. Dig deeper into the data and the real-world impact of government policies.
And I think that's a perfect segue into something I wanted to ask you about.
All right.
The article mentions this poll that found only 12% of Americans think it's a good idea for billionaires to advise presidents. That's a really low number.
It is. Why do you think that is?
I think it reflects a growing distrust of the super wealthy and their influence on government. There's a sense that billionaires like Elon Musk are just out of touch with the needs of everyday Americans.
It's like they're living in a different world.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And when you have someone like Musk,
Right.
who has made his fortune
Yeah.
in tech and space exploration, suddenly put in charge
Yeah.
of making decisions about essential government services.
Right.
It raises a lot of eyebrows.
People are probably thinking, what does he know about running a government agency? What are his qualifications?
Right. And Richardson's article
Yeah.
really underscores the potential dangers
Okay.
of this approach.
You mean like putting ideologues
Yeah.
with no real-world experience in charge of making decisions that affect
Exactly.
millions of people?
Things can go wrong very quickly.
So what you're saying is that slashing budgets and firing people isn't the answer.
It's much more complicated than that.
Okay.
There are real consequences to those actions.
Right.
And they often end up hurting the most vulnerable members of society.
That's an important point to keep in mind. It seems like there's a lot more to this issue of government spending than meets the eye.
There is. And I think Richardson's article does a great job of exposing the myths and misconceptions surrounding this topic.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. Yeah, it really has. This whole conversation has been incredibly eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm seeing government spending in a totally new light.
I'm glad to hear that. It's so easy to get caught up in the rhetoric.
Yeah.
But it's so important to step back and look at the bigger picture.
And I think that's what Richardson does so brilliantly in this article. She doesn't just present the facts.
Right.
She connects them to these larger historical trends and societal forces. It's like she's giving us this roadmap for understanding how we got to where we are today.
Exactly. And that understanding is crucial if we want to make informed decisions about the future.
So if we kind of connect this back to our listener, what's the one thing you'd want them to take away from this deep dive? What's the most important thing to keep in mind when it comes to government spending?
I think the most important thing is to just be aware of the narratives that we're being fed.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as complex and impactful as government spending.
Right.
Don't just blindly accept what politicians or pundits tell you.
Right. Question everything.
Exactly. Ask yourself, who benefits from this narrative? What are the underlying assumptions? And most importantly, what are the real-world consequences of these policies?
That's great advice. And for you listening, it might be interesting to consider this. What government programs do you benefit from?
Right.
Directly or indirectly? And how might these recent changes we discussed impact your life or your community?
That's a great question for everyone to ponder.
Right.
We often take these programs for granted.
Right.
But they play a huge role in our lives, whether we realize it or not.
Absolutely. And sometimes it takes like a drastic event, like these sudden cuts, to make us realize how much we actually depend on these services.
It could be a real wake-up call.
Right.
And hopefully it inspires us to be more engaged and informed citizens.
I hope so, too.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we all have a stake in this.
Right.
Government spending isn't some abstract concept. It has a very real impact on our lives and the lives of our communities.
It affects everything.
Right.
From the quality of our schools and healthcare to the safety of our food and water.
Exactly. So to kind of wrap things up, I think the message is clear.
Yeah.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep diving deeper.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us.
Of course.
On this deep dive. Until next time.